At 60 years old, I believed the hardest battles of my life were behind me. I had survived divorce, raised a child alone, and built an empire with my bare hands. I thought marriage would finally bring me peace. I was wrong. Because the man I married didn't fall in love with me. He fell in love with what I owned. And by the time I realized it, my name was already being erased from the life I spent 30 years building. At 60 years old, I truly believed the hardest battles of my life were already behind me. I had survived a broken marriage in my 30s. I had raised a child on my own when money was tight and the future felt uncertain. And against all odds, I had built something lasting with my own hands, something real, something no one could ever take from me. So when I finally said yes to love again, I thought I was choosing peace. I was wrong. Because the man I married didn't fall in love with my heart first. He fell in love with the life I had built. And by the time I realized it, that life was already in danger. My name is Catherine Morrison. Most people call me Kathy. And for over 3 decades, my world revolved around one piece of land in a quiet valley most people had never heard of when I first arrived. Back then, I was a 30-something single mother with dirt under my nails, unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and a dream that everyone else thought was foolish. I bought my first small stretch of land when my daughter was still in elementary school. 5 acres, bare earth, no buildings, no vines, just potential. Banks didn't take me seriously, neighbors whispered behind my back, and more than one person suggested I'd sell within a year. But I didn't. I worked days in real estate and spent my nights and weekends planting, learning, failing, and starting again. My daughter helped me tie young vines to posts after school, her small hands careful and proud. For years, nothing came easy. Crops failed. Weather turned cruel. Money disappeared faster than it came in. Still, I stayed. By the time my daughter was grown, that land had become a thriving estate. The business supported us. My name carried respect. I had employees who trusted me, partners who valued my word, and a reputation built on consistency and integrity. Every decision, every risk, every long night, I owned it all. And yet, success has a strange side, effect people don't talk about. Loneliness. When my daughter left to build her own life, the farmhouse grew quieter. Evenings stretched long. Achievements that once felt exhilarating began to feel hollow without someone to share them with. I didn't want extravagance or excitement. I wanted companionship, conversation, someone to sit beside me at the end of the day. That's when I met him. He was charming in a refined way, polished, confident, the kind of man who knew exactly how to make people feel seen. Recently widowed, retired, well-spoken. He admired my work, asked thoughtful questions, listened intently when I spoke about challenges I'd faced in an industry that rarely welcomed women like me. He made me feel appreciated. And after years of standing strong alone, that feeling mattered more than I realized. Our relationship moved faster than I expected. Dinners turned into weekends. Weekends turned into plans. He spoke of the future with certainty, with warmth, with an assurance that made me feel safe. I ignored how often he praised not just me, but the estate, the land, the legacy. I told myself I was overthinking it. At 60, I didn't feel fragile. I felt accomplished, capable, grounded. I had built a life that couldn't be shaken by emotion alone. Or so I believed. Because once the engagement was announced, something changed. It wasn't him at first. It was his children. Their smiles were polite, their questions were curious, and their interest in my life went far beyond wanting to know me as a person. They wanted details, numbers, structure, ownership, and each question left me slightly more uneasy than the last. I brushed it off as protectiveness, as concern, as normal family behavior. But deep down, Something quiet and uncomfortable began to stir. A feeling I had learned to trust decades earlier, back when ignoring it could cost everything. And as I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the vines I had planted myself, I had no idea that the biggest threat to my life's work wasn't drought, fire, or the market. It was already sitting at my table. I told myself I was being paranoid, until his daughter asked me one question that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with ownership. I wish I could say the warning signs were loud and obvious. They weren't. They arrived quietly, disguised as concern, curiosity, and family interest. The kind of interest that smiles while measuring what you have. The first time I met his children after the engagement, I wanted everything to go well. I set the table myself, opened one of my better bottles, and reminded myself that blending families later in life was always complicated. They were grieving their mother. I was stepping into a space that once belonged to someone else. So I chose patience. There were 3 of them, all grown, all successful in their own right, at least on the surface. His eldest son spoke like a man used to numbers and control. He asked about production volumes and distribution routes while swirling his wine, his tone casual but focused. His middle child, his daughter, walked through the farmhouse slowly, her eyes lingering on walls, beams, and windows the way real estate developers assess value. The youngest stayed quiet at first, listening, absorbing. I told myself I was imagining things. Then the questions became more direct. "How long has the property been in your family?" his daughter asked, pausing near the window that overlooked the vines. "Who actually owns the land?" his son added, smiling as if it were small talk. I answered carefully. I had learned long ago that clarity wasn't always protection. I spoke about legacy, about long-term planning, about how complicated family arrangements could be. I avoided specifics. I didn't lie, but I didn't reveal everything either. Their interest didn't fade. It sharpened. They wanted to know about revenue, about insurance, about estate planning, about what would happen down the line. Each question landed with just enough plausibility to avoid confrontation, yet together they formed a pattern that made my shoulders tense. I looked to my fiancé more than once, waiting for him to redirect the conversation, to tell them they were crossing a line. He never did. Instead, he squeezed my hand, smiled warmly, and said things like, "They're just trying to be responsible," or "They mean well, they've always been planners." That night, after everyone left, I lay awake replaying every word. This wasn't curiosity. This was evaluation. A few days later, my daughter came to visit. She had always been sharp, observant in ways I sometimes was. She walked the estate with me, noticing things I had stopped seeing because they were so familiar. At sunset, we sat on the porch with glasses of wine. She didn't speak right away. Then she said, "Mom, are you sure about this?" I laughed it off at first, told her I was happy, that I deserved companionship, that I had been alone long enough. She didn't smile. "The way his kids look at this place," she said quietly. "They don't see home, they see numbers." I told her she was being protective, that she didn't know them yet, that not everyone who asks questions has bad intentions. She hesitated, then asked the one question I wasn't prepared for. "Did you protect yourself legally?" I assured her I had. I had been around business long enough to know better. Attorneys were involved. Boundaries were in place. She nodded, but her eyes stayed troubled. That night, I stood in my office long after everyone had gone to bed. I opened drawers, reviewed old documents, and touched the edges of folders that represented decades of work. Every signature inside them was mine. Every decision had been earned. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt exposed. Not weak. Exposed. I realized then that love doesn't erase power dynamics. Marriage doesn't erase ownership, and kindness doesn't guarantee safety. So I made a choice. A quiet one. I decided I would never speak openly about what I owned, how much it was worth, or how it was structured. Not to him, not to his children, not to anyone who hadn't stood beside me when the land was nothing but dirt and doubt. If they saw complexity instead of clarity, uncertainty instead of certainty, they would hesitate. And hesitation, I knew from experience, could buy time. The wedding plans moved forward, smiles returned, conversations softened, but underneath it all I was watching, listening, and waiting. Because once someone starts counting what they think you have, the next step is deciding how to take it. The night before my wedding, my daughter asked me one final question, and the answer I gave her would later save everything I had built. The night before my wedding, sleep wouldn't come. The farmhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually brought me comfort. But that night, it felt heavy. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the vines outside, thinking about how strange it was that after everything I had survived, love was what made me feel most uncertain. Earlier that evening, my daughter and I had sat together in the kitchen, the same space where she had done homework as a child, and where I had signed my first risky loan papers decades earlier. She looked at me carefully before speaking. "Mom," she said, "I know you want happiness. I want that for you too, but promise me something." I asked what. "Promise me you won't give up control of what you built, not even a little, not for anyone." I told her I wouldn't, and I meant it. But there was something I didn't tell her. Something I hadn't told anyone. The next morning, under an arch of twisting vines and soft morning light, I married the man I believed would be my partner. The ceremony was small, elegant, and emotional. His children stood nearby, smiling, supportive, and gracious. Guests toasted to new beginnings. Photographs were taken. Laughter echoed across the estate. To anyone watching, it looked like a perfect second chance at love. Behind my smile, I was already guarding something. Before the wedding, my attorney had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. It wasn't romantic, but it was necessary. Everything I had acquired before the marriage remained mine. The land, the business, the accounts, all of it. He signed it. He didn't argue, though I could tell he didn't love the idea. He said he understood, said he admired my independence, said he had no interest in what wasn't his. And that was true, at least on paper. What I never disclosed, what I never clarified, was the full truth about ownership. When questions arose, I let things stay vague. I spoke in general terms about family arrangements and long-standing structures. I allowed assumptions to form without correcting them. It wasn't manipulation. It was protection. After the wedding, he moved into the farmhouse. His things filled the spare rooms. His routines blended into mine. For a while, life felt good, comfortable, peaceful. He didn't interfere with my work. He didn't demand access to accounts. He didn't push. That's what made the shift so unsettling when it finally came. It started subtly. He began suggesting small changes, updating paperwork, streamlining processes. "Just in case," he said, "it's good to be organized." Then came the forms. He slid them across the kitchen table casually, as if they were nothing more than administrative housekeeping. Insurance updates, beneficiary confirmations, standard married couple stuff. I read everything. Some of the documents weren't what he claimed they were. They went beyond insurance, beyond logistics. They asked for authority, for access, for permissions I had never given anyone before. I declined politely. He didn't like that. The warmth cooled, conversations shortened, silence replaced affection. Days passed where he barely spoke to me, and when he did, there was an edge I hadn't heard before. Around the same time, his children became more present. Unannounced visits, offers to help, suggestions disguised as advice. His daughter brought up property assessments again. His eldest mentioned long-term planning more than once. The youngest talked about modernizing systems I already had in place. They were circling. One afternoon, I returned from a meeting earlier than expected and walked into my office at the winery. My filing cabinet drawer was open. Papers were out of place. Nothing was missing, but something had been touched. That night, I stood alone in the room, my fingers brushing the worn wood of my desk, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on me. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was preparation. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I did what had kept me alive in business for decades. I observed, I documented, I waited. Because if someone is willing to test boundaries quietly, they're usually planning to cross them loudly. And I had the unsettling feeling that something was already moving behind my back. I believed the prenup would protect me, until I realized they weren't planning to fight me in court. They were planning to take everything without asking. There's a moment when suspicion turns into certainty. For me, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confession, no sudden discovery of a missing fortune. It was quieter than that and far more terrifying. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had returned from a routine meeting earlier than planned. The winery was calm, the hum of equipment steady and familiar. As I walked toward my office, something felt off before I even opened the door. The filing cabinet drawer was open. I stood there for a long second, staring at it, my heart slowing instead of racing. Over the years, I had trained myself to stay calm when something felt wrong. Panic clouds judgment. Stillness sharpens it. Inside, folders sat slightly out of alignment. Papers that were usually clipped were loose. Nothing obvious was gone, but someone had been searching. Not browsing. Searching. That evening, I asked my husband casually if anyone had needed access to the office while I was gone. He smiled too quickly. "Oh, the kids were here earlier," he said. "They were just looking for some insurance paperwork. No big deal." I didn't respond right away. My office wasn't a shared space. It never had been. Everyone who worked for me knew that. His children knew it too. I let the comment pass. From that day forward, I noticed everything. The way phone calls happened outside, always away from earshot. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The sudden interest in processes that had functioned smoothly for years. My husband began bringing documents home more often. He'd place them on the table after dinner, casually, like an afterthought. "Just routine updates," he'd say. "Nothing urgent." I read every word. Some were harmless, others were not. A few documents requested authority that no one needed but me. Others referenced accounts or properties in ways that felt deliberately vague. When I refused to sign, his patience wore thinner each time. "Why are you being so difficult?" he asked one night, frustration leaking through his polished calm. "We're married." "I'm being careful," I replied. The difference mattered. His mood shifted after that. Warmth turned to distance. Silence became punishment. The house felt colder despite the shared roof. Meanwhile, his daughter started showing up with explanations that didn't hold up. Insurance concerns, market trends, just wanting to help. She spoke about valuations and comparable properties as if she were already preparing a report. I reminded her, politely but firmly, that I had professionals handling those matters. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I realized then that they weren't reacting to my refusal. They were adjusting their strategy. One evening, I overheard a phone call by accident. I wasn't eavesdropping. I simply walked into the kitchen when I thought no one was home. My husband stood near the back door, his voice low and tense. "She's cautious," he said, "but it's manageable." Manageable. That single word stayed with me. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and pulled out every important document I had. Titles, deeds, corporate filings, trust paperwork. I cross-checked dates, signatures, and registration numbers. Everything appeared intact. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my attorney. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't panic. I simply asked her to verify everything. Quietly, thoroughly. "Just a precaution," I said. She didn't ask questions. She understood the tone. A few days later, she called me back. Her voice was different. Careful, controlled, tight. She told me someone had been filing documents at the county office, documents that referenced my property, transfer language, partnership wording, filings that shouldn't exist. I told her I hadn't signed anything. She paused. Then she said the words that changed everything. "The signatures look like yours," she said, "but they're not." I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because curiosity and manipulation were one thing. Forgery was something else entirely. When my attorney told me someone had been filing documents in my name, I realized this wasn't betrayal anymore. It was a crime. I sat in my car long after the call ended, the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel as if gripping it would steady the world around me. Forgery. The word echoed louder than any accusation ever could. I had spent decades signing documents, contracts, permits, loans, agreements, so I knew my signature as well as I knew my own handwriting. Hearing that someone had imitated it, tried to pass it off as mine, made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. My attorney didn't exaggerate. "These filings won't hold up once challenged," she said carefully. "But the fact that they exist means someone is testing boundaries. And Kathy, people don't do this by accident." I asked the question I was afraid of. "Who filed them?" She paused. "They were submitted in person, but the supporting paperwork points directly back to your husband and his children." I felt something shift inside me then. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't overstepping. This was a plan. I went home and behaved exactly as I always had. I made dinner. I listened. I smiled. I didn't let my voice shake. If they were watching me, and I suspected they were, I refused to give them anything useful. That night, my husband tried again. He brought another document to the table, this one thinner, simpler. He explained it quickly, too quickly. "It's just to make things easier if something ever happens," he said. "You know, emergencies." I read it twice. It granted authority I would never willingly give. I pushed it back toward him. "I'm not signing this." His face hardened. "Why not?" he asked. "Do you think I'm trying to take something from you?" I looked at him and said nothing. Silence can be an answer. He stood up so abruptly the chair scraped across the floor. He didn't speak to me for 2 days after that. Instead, the calls increased. Late at night, early mornings, always taken outside, always ending when I approached. That's when I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. So I made a call of my own. There was a man I had worked with years ago, back when I was in real estate, someone who knew how to find truth buried under polite surfaces and clean resumes. He had retired, but when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "I'll take a look," he said. "Everything." I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell his children. I didn't even tell my daughter, not yet. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I moved through them carefully, observing more than speaking. I noticed patterns I had once ignored. The way his children spoke in terms of when rather than if. The way my husband framed decisions as inevitable rather than optional. Then the investigator called. He asked to meet in person. That alone told me the truth wouldn't be simple. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. He placed a thick folder on the table between us. "Your husband's past isn't as clean as it looks," he said. What he uncovered went beyond financial ambition. Before me, there had been another wife. Actually, more than one. Each story followed a disturbingly similar pattern: marriage later in life, gradual control, paperwork signed quietly, assets transferred shortly before illness or death, family members who raised concerns but were silenced by legal complexity and settlements. He showed me timelines, names, records. My chest tightened. "Is this real?" I asked. He nodded. I wouldn't be sitting here if it was. I went home that night and walked the estate alone. I touched the vines, the stone walls, the doors I had unlocked thousands of times. I thought about how close I had come to losing it all, not through mismanagement or bad luck, but through trust. I realized then that I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was standing at the edge of a pattern that needed to end. And I wasn't going to be the woman who looked away. What the investigator uncovered next made my blood run cold, because I wasn't the first woman this family had done this to. I was just the next one. I didn't open the folder right away. I brought it home, placed it on my desk, and stared at it for a long time. Some part of me still hoped there was a misunderstanding, that the investigator had overreached, that context would soften what I was about to read. It didn't. Inside were timelines, legal filings, hospital records, and settlement agreements. Names I didn't recognize at first, faces I had never seen, women whose lives intersected with my husband's long before mine ever did. The first wife had been wealthy in her own right. The transfer of her assets had occurred months before her death, under circumstances that raised questions but never quite crossed the legal threshold needed for prosecution. Her family had contested it. The case had settled quietly. The second had died suddenly. Her children tried to challenge the paperwork. They were blocked by attorneys who specialized in making challenges disappear. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Late-life marriage, gradual isolation, increased paperwork, assets shifted, family pushed away, questions dismissed. And now me. I sat there long enough for the sun to disappear behind the hills, feeling a strange mix of nausea and resolve. Fear had already done its worst. What remained was anger, controlled, deliberate, useful. That night, my husband sat across from me at dinner, talking casually about plans for the coming year. Expansions, improvements, legacy decisions, he called them. I nodded. Inside, I was planning something very different. The investigator had been clear. These weren't impulsive people. They were patient, strategic, experienced, and that meant confronting them directly without preparation would be a mistake. So I didn't. Instead, I went back to my attorney and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she closed her notebook slowly and said, "If we do this, we do it carefully." We assembled a small, trusted team, a forensic accountant, another legal specialist, quiet consultations with law enforcement, not accusations, just verification. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Emails surfaced, messages that discussed timing and pressure, drafts of documents that were never meant for my eyes, conversations about what would happen once she agrees or if something changes. They weren't just reacting to my caution. They were anticipating my resistance. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. My husband continued his routine, unaware that every conversation was being documented. His children remained cordial, their smiles practiced, their interest persistent. One evening, his daughter said something that confirmed everything. "You've built something impressive," she said lightly. "It would be a shame if it didn't stay in the family." I smiled back. "It will," I said. She assumed she knew what I meant. She was wrong. As the evidence grew, so did my certainty. This wasn't about inheritance or misunderstanding. It was about control, about entitlement, about identifying people who had something worth taking and convincing them, quietly, to hand it over. I thought about the women before me, about how easily this could have ended differently if I had been less cautious. If I had signed just one more document, if I had believed discomfort was rudeness. That realization hardened something in me. I wasn't just protecting my estate anymore. I was ending a cycle. But justice doesn't move quickly. And while the legal process was building behind the scenes, I wanted one thing before it all came crashing down. I wanted the truth out in the open. So I planned a moment they would never forget. A moment they would walk into willingly. A moment where there would be nowhere to hide. I didn't confront them. I planned something far more final, a gathering they would never forget. By the time I sent the invitation, I was calm. Not the fragile kind of calm that comes from denial, but the steady calm that arrives when you finally understand the rules of the game being played around you. I told my husband I wanted to host a small dinner at the estate. Nothing extravagant, just family, a few close friends, and good wine. I framed it as a celebration, an acknowledgement of how far we had come together. He loved the idea. For months, he had been trying to pull me closer into his version of family. A dinner like this felt, to him, like a victory. His children agreed without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? They believed the situation was still unfolding in their favor. From their perspective, patience had always paid off before. I chose the date carefully. Everything behind the scenes was ready. The documentation was complete. The professionals were prepared. Every step had been taken quietly, legally, and deliberately. All that remained was the moment itself. In the days leading up to the dinner, I watched them closely. My husband was attentive again, almost affectionate. He spoke about future trips, about simplifying things in the coming months. His confidence had returned. That told me everything. On the afternoon of the dinner, the estate looked beautiful. Tables were set along the patio overlooking the vines. Candles flickered in the early evening light. Bottles from my best vintages were opened and breathing. It felt surreal, standing there knowing what was about to happen. Guests arrived in waves. First, my daughter. She hugged me tightly, her grip lingering just long enough to say she understood. She knew what this night meant. Then his children arrived, dressed impeccably, smiling broadly. Compliments flowed freely. They praised the setting, the wine, the view, as if they were already imagining it as something they belonged to. My husband arrived last, proud and relaxed, greeting everyone like a host who believed the evening was under his control. Then the final guests arrived. They were the ones he wasn't expecting. My attorney, the investigator, and two people he hadn't seen in years. I watched his face change the moment he recognized them. Confusion, fear, then anger. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "This is family," I said, "and witnesses." The table went silent. I stood, holding a glass of wine, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel small or uncertain. I felt exactly where I belonged, on my land, in my truth. I spoke calmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse, I simply stated facts. About the documents filed without my consent, about the forged signatures, about the pattern that stretched back before I ever entered his life. His children tried to interrupt. One stood up, another laughed nervously. The youngest stared at the table, suddenly very interested in his glass. Then the investigator spoke. Then my attorney. Then the others. Each truth landed heavier than the last. My husband said nothing. When law enforcement stepped forward, the evening transformed in an instant. Conversations dissolved into chaos. Excuses flew. Denials collapsed. One child tried to claim ignorance. Another blamed everyone else. Through it all, I stayed still. As they were escorted away, my husband finally looked at me, not with affection, not even with anger, but with disbelief. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected preparation. He hadn't expected me. As the handcuffs clicked shut, I knew the hardest part was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The sound of handcuffs is quieter than people imagine. There was no dramatic crash, no raised voices from the officers. Just the soft, final click of metal closing around wrists that had signed papers they thought no one would ever question. That sound echoed louder than any argument ever could. My husband stood frozen as the reality settled in. His children reacted differently. One tried to explain, another protested loudly, the third stayed silent, eyes fixed on the ground. They had walked into the evening expecting celebration. Instead, they were facing consequences. Guests watched in stunned silence as law enforcement guided them away from the table, past the candles, past the vines glowing in the evening light. It felt surreal, like a scene unfolding in someone else's life. But it was mine. As they were led toward the waiting vehicles, my husband turned back to me. For a moment, I saw something raw on his face, not regret, not love, but disbelief. He truly hadn't thought I would fight back. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. That night, after everyone was gone and the estate had grown quiet again, I walked the property alone. The same path I had walked thousands of times before. The vines rustled softly in the breeze, unchanged by the chaos that had just unfolded among them. I felt exhausted, but lighter. The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. Statements, depositions, evidence submissions. The paper trail my attorney had carefully assembled spoke louder than anything I ever could. Forged signatures, coordinated filings, messages that revealed intent, not accident. There was no escaping it. The criminal case moved forward faster than I expected. Plea deals were discussed. Charges formalized. The public record filled in gaps that private settlements had once buried. My husband went to trial. Sitting in the courtroom, I watched a version of him unravel that I had never truly known. The confidence that once charmed me now read as calculation. The polished words rang hollow when placed next to evidence. The verdict came down heavy. Convictions followed. Sentences were handed out. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I felt something closer to closure. The divorce was finalized quietly not long after. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as it was written. He walked away with nothing from my life's work. Legal fees consumed what he had left. I returned to the estate, back to my routines, back to the work that had grounded me long before he ever appeared. My daughter came more often. We talked, worked, planned. Slowly, she began taking an interest in parts of the business she once avoided. Watching me stand my ground had changed something for her. For both of us. People asked if I regretted marrying him. The answer surprised them. No. Because I didn't lose myself. I didn't lose my work. I didn't lose my future. I learned something far more valuable. I learned that trust without boundaries is vulnerability, that love doesn't require surrender, and that protecting what you build isn't selfish, it's necessary. The estate is thriving now. The vines are healthy. The wine is strong. Every bottle carries the weight of survival and intention. Sometimes, when guests ask about the history of the place, I tell them pieces of the story. Not the fear, but the strength. And when the sun sets over the land I fought to keep, I feel something deeper than happiness. I feel free. People think the story ends with arrests and convictions. But the most important part came after, when I finally understood what my silence had protected and what it had taught me. Today, I'm 69 years old. When people hear my story, they often focus on the scandal, the betrayal, the courtroom drama. They ask about the arrest, the sentence, the fallout. But that's not the part that stays with me. What stays with me is what didn't happen. I didn't lose my land. I didn't lose my work. I didn't lose myself. After everything was finalized, life settled back into a rhythm that felt familiar and grounding. I returned to early mornings walking the vineyard rows, checking vines, making decisions that were once again mine alone. The estate didn't just survive, it flourished. Something else changed too. My daughter came back. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She started spending more time at the winery, asking questions, learning details she once thought she didn't care about. We worked side by side, not as parent and child, but as two women protecting something meaningful. Watching her step into that space felt like the final reward for everything I had endured. I never remarried. People assume that means I became bitter or closed off. The truth is simpler. I became clearer. I no longer confuse companionship with surrender. I no longer believe love requires me to hand over what I spent a lifetime building. And I tell my story now for a reason. Especially to women who have built something later in life. Women who are independent, accomplished, and suddenly told they should share everything because they've found love again. Hear what I learned the hard way. Protecting yourself isn't a lack of trust. It's an act of respect for your past, your effort, and your future. The decision I made to stay quiet about ownership wasn't about deception. It was about observation. That silence gave me time to see who people really were when they thought opportunity was within reach. If I had announced what I owned from the beginning, things would have moved faster. More pressure, more urgency, less room to notice patterns. That pause saved everything. I also learned that the person you marry is not always the person you meet. Time reveals truths charm hides, and boundaries don't ruin love, they reveal intentions. Today, when visitors walk the estate and ask about its history, I don't soften the truth anymore. I tell them I built it. I fought for it. I protected it. Every vine, every bottle, every acre. Mine. And when the sun sets over the land, I don't feel lonely. I feel proud. Because I was never a victim. I was never a target. I was prepared. And that made all the difference.